Welcome back to the Code Wolf. Today's video is all about the latest 5.0 version of DbChatPro. And yes, it's okay if this is your first introduction to the series. DbChatPro is a powerful app that lets you query and chat with your relational database using AI and natural language. The app accomplishes all of this without having to index your data with a search service, without RAG architecture, no fine-tuning. Just connect your AI model and database to the app and you're good to go. Essentially, the AI is given the schema of your database, translates your natural language prompts into SQL queries based on that schema, and then the app executes those queries on behalf of you and the AI. Now, I've timestamped the sections below so you can pick what you're interested in, whether you're a new or returning user. We'll start with a demo of all of the new features, and along the way, use that demo to show how the app generally works for newcomers. The new 5.0 version introduces support for AWS Bedrock's AI service and models, as well as GitHub AI models, and like previous versions, still of course supports OpenAI, Azure OpenAI, and local AI models. On the database side, by popular demand, the 5.0 version finally adds support for Oracle relational databases and continues to support SQL Server, Postgres, and MySQL. There's also now an option to export your data table results as CSVs. After the demo, I'll also show you how to configure the app to use these new services and the basics of how to get it running on your local computer. Toward the end of the video, I'll cover some exciting changes to the DbChatPro project itself. We'll discuss all of this in much more detail in each of the sections timestamped below, so let's get started. Okay, so let's start by looking at the new features of DbChatPro 5.0, and along the way that'll serve as kind of a demo of how the app works overall if you're new to it. So as always, when the app first starts up, you'll get this message that you haven't connected to a database yet, so we'll want to go to our connections page to set that up. And so here we can add a connection between our app and the database. Remember, the AI never has direct access to your database. Everything kind of passes through the app. Any SQL queries are executed by the app itself and not by the AI, which only knows about your schema. So speaking of that schema, let's connect our first database so that we can analyze the schema of it. And so for this example, let's choose the new Oracle database type. So this is new in 5.0, and then we can give this a name. And I have an HR sample database set up on this computer. So if we go over to Oracle SQL Developer, there's a common sample database out there used with Oracle, and it has a handful of tables in here. So we're going to connect to this through our app. So I'm going to plug in a connection string, and this is a pretty standard connection string format when connecting with .NET to Oracle. So we're going to connect to our local service here, and we've got an HR user set up with our HR password here. So let's run check connection. And you'll see that it discovered the following tables and columns, which sure enough line up with the ones that we see in SQL Developer. And if you expand these, you can kind of see the column names and so on. But I'm just going to hit save, so that will pop in over into our connections list. And now let's go back to our dashboard. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit here to make this easier to see. So now that we have a database connection established and we analyze that schema, you can see that schema pops in over on the right. And so you can kind of reference this as you're using the app. When you're coming up with the queries or prompts that you want to run. So the next thing we need to do is configure which AI platform we want to use to translate our prompts into SQL queries. So we have our HR database selected, that's our only one. And now we can choose between 5 different AI platforms. So GitHub Models and AWS Bedrock, these are both new in 5.0. And then these other 3 we've had since the last version. So I'm going to choose AWS Bedrock. And for AWS, we want to plug in the model ID. So I'm just going to paste that in here. We're going to use Claude 3.7 for this. And so if I go out into Amazon, you can see I've enabled access to this model on my account. And then you can get the ID for that down here. So you would just copy this model ID. I'll show a little bit more about how to get this set up later on. But let's jump back over to our app. And so now we have our AI configured and we have our database connected. So now we can say something like, get me all of the departments. So over here we have this department table, and I'll say submit. And sure enough, it comes back with our list of departments. So it looks like there's 27 departments, and we can kind of page through here in this nice little data table. And using this schema over on the right, our AI can do a lot more than just listing table data. So for example, here we have this marketing department name. So let's say we want to find all the employees who are in the marketing department. So we could say, get me all the employees in the marketing department. So this will be a combination of the employee table and the department table, or at least the relationship between them. It has to analyze that. So let that run a second. And it looks like there's two employees who are in the marketing department. So over here it says marketing as their department name. And of course, you can always go over to the SQL Editor tab to see what query it came up with. So this is the query that the AI generated, and then our app ran it to generate that data table. So our app is kind of that bridge between the AI and the database. And of course, on this Insights tab, it gives some more information about how it came up with that query. Now, besides AWS, we also have access to GitHub models. So these are kind of on-demand models as well that are really easy to set up in GitHub if you haven't tried it out. If you go over to your marketplace over on the left here and then to models, you can explore all kinds of different models that are available on demand. This one is GPT-4o. We'll look at that more in a second. But if we go back to our app, so let's select GitHub models and then that GPT-4o option there. And for our query this time, I'll say list all of the jobs or something simple like that. And then our job titles come back just fine. And so here we have an accountant role. So let's say list all of the employees who work as an accountant, and we'll see what it comes up with. And so there's our different accountant employees. And over here, we can see that department ID lined up with the one from our accountant query earlier. And so this showcases how both AWS and GitHub are now supported as well, just like we used to have with these other three platforms. Now, there's one other cool feature here, which is the ability to export data. This was requested by several different people in comments and such, so I just kind of added in this button. If we click on this, this will actually export the table data here into a CSV. And so if we open up that in Excel, sure enough, there's our data table. So you can now export the query results. If you have multiple pages on your data table, those will all get exported out as a single CSV. So it's not just the data displayed here, it's actually all of the results that get exported out as a CSV. So that feature is there as well. And if you're new to this app, we also have other features, so you can favorite queries and you can view your history and such, and rerun those queries and all that. So there's plenty of other things this app can do, but the main point here is that we now have GitHub and AWS models available, and we're connected to an Oracle database here. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how to get this app set up and running on your computer, but I'll talk a lot more about this at the end of the video when we look at some of the exciting changes to this GitHub project. So you'll want to go out to this repo, and I'll have all these links in the description, and you'll just want to pull this down onto your local computer. You can either download it as a zip and extract that, or if you're comfortable with Git, you can just clone that using a Git command. So once you pull that down, that's going to look like this. So we have our root folder here. And then you can either double click on this SLN file to open it in Visual Studio, or if you prefer to use code, you can just right click and say open with code. So I'm just going to show how to do this using Visual Studio. So I have that app open here. And configuring the app is actually pretty simple as long as you have access to AI services and databases. That's really the more difficult part. I'm not going to get too far into how to configure all those different platforms in this video, but I want to show you how to configure the app if you do have access to use these new features. So you're going to want to open up this app settings.development.json. So this is your local configuration file. And the way this app works is there's just a config setting for each of the AI platforms. And as long as you provide a value, they'll show up in the UI as available to work with. So for example, you could add your Azure endpoint or your OpenAI key and such. And you could have your OpenAI key, a Llama endpoint. But the two new ones are this GitHub Models key and this AWS profile. So let's look at GitHub first. This one is really simple to set up. Pretty much anyone with a GitHub account can use this, which is part of the reason I wanted to add it into the app. It removes a lot of barriers for people. So you'll just want to go out to your GitHub account. And then if you go down to your settings, so if you click on settings and then go into your developer settings, you'll have this personal access token section. So just choose fine-grained tokens, and then you can say generate new token, and just give it a name, and you can actually leave everything as the default here, and click generate, and then copy the value that creates, and then you'll plug that into your GitHub Models key here. Now, with GitHub, a lot of AI models are just ready to go. You don't have to deploy them or anything. Once you have your key, you're all set. So in the UI, you can just enter in GPT 4.0 like I did in the demo, or just browse the available AI models out on the GitHub Marketplace site. And you should be able to access any of those once you have your key. Now, for AWS, if you're using this, I'm going to assume you have some experience working with AWS. Setting up this whole profile is a pretty involved process, actually, if you've never done it before. So that would certainly be a tutorial of its own. But just for some context, I've set up this user. This is a user called CodeWolf, and I created a local profile for this with an access key and all of that. So this has permissions to access the AWS Bedrock service. And then, like I said before, I already enabled the Claude 3.7 model. So that's the one we used in the demo. So what you would do is go back in here, and then you would enter in the name of that local profile on your computer. So for me, that was the CodeWolf, and then you would enter in the region, the default region you want to use, which for me was US East 1. So you would fill those in, and then the code is set up so that it will actually pull that profile off of your local computer. So if we look at the program.cs file here, there's some stuff here to use the AWS SDK to actually authenticate using that profile and set up your dependency injection with that correctly. So you'll just want to make sure you do have that local profile. I decided this was sort of the best general purpose approach for this, but admittedly, I don't have quite as much experience working with AWS as I do with other platforms like Azure. So if you have other recommendations of what you'd like to see here for authenticating to AWS, maybe we can look at that for a future update. So leave a comment there. But right now, this is using those local profiles. And that's true for the other platforms as well. So even for our databases, for example, I just added support for Oracle, but this sample connection strings file, these are the connection string formats supported for each database. If you want to see more formats supported, we could potentially add those in as features. But I provided these examples here so you know what it's looking for. So for example, this new Oracle connection, this is assuming a username and password and a data source and so on with your service name. But if there's something else you'd really like to see in here supported, we might be able to get that in there as well. Okay, so I want to spend just a minute here for those who are interested to look at how these updates were implemented through the code because they kind of showcase the extensible architecture of this app. I'm not going to give a full code tour in this video, we're just going to focus on these new changes. So in our services folder, we have this database management service, and this basically decides which subservice or specific implementation to use when fulfilling database requests. So every database service, regardless of the technology, just has to implement two methods. One is called getDataTable, which runs the SQL query generated by the AI to get back our data results. And the other method is generateSchema. So this is the one that analyzes the schema of the connected database and then provides that schema so that it can be consumed by the AI and it understands how our database is structured. So for Oracle, we just added this additional case here, and that applies down here as well. And so this will call the new Oracle Database Service. And so all of these different database services implement this interface, this iDatabase service. So if we were to look at that, again, that just has those two methods on it. So every database that connects to the app needs to fulfill these two methods. And in the case of Oracle, this is really pretty similar to the other databases such as SQL Server. The only real difference is that we're using an Oracle connection here and an Oracle command. And then further down, we need a little bit different query here to analyze the schema. Each database handles this slightly differently. So in our generate schema method, we're just running a slightly different SQL command there. But for the most part, the Oracle implementation is pretty similar to the other services. So just go ahead and check that out. And I also want to just point this out because you could also add another service for whatever database you want to support as long as it's sort of a general relational SQL database. And you just have to implement these two methods and you'll be good to go. Now, for the AI side of things, this was a little more complicated. So we have this AI service, and this service assembles the query that gets sent to the AI. So you can see it's building this fancy query, and it sends along the schema of our database and such. So this is the main method that assembles that big prompt that gets sent to the AI. And down here, it creates the appropriate client for different AI models. So you can see we pass in the AI service and the AI model. And then it runs a conditional to see which type of AI client it should provide. Now, previously, we had these top three in here because these are supported by the Microsoft Extensions AI libraries. So if we look at the NuGet packages here, you can see there's a bunch of Microsoft Extensions AI packages in here. And what's nice about these packages is that they provide abstractions, so you can kind of just code against an interface and swap out the different underlying clients, sort of like we saw with our database service. So whether you're using Azure OpenAI, or Olama, they all use a similar interface. Now, that package also supports GitHub models with a slightly different setup here. So that one was pretty easy to add. I just went ahead and added another case, and we now have this chat completions client, and this hooks up to the GitHub Models endpoint and pulls in our GitHub Models key and all of that. So this one was already supported by Microsoft Extensions. I just hadn't added it to the app yet, and so that one was pretty easy. Now, AWS Bedrock was a whole different animal, so this one required a lot more work. But what's nice about these Microsoft Extensions AI libraries is that you can actually provide your own implementation of those interfaces if there isn't one for the platform you want. So for example, if we were to go into this Olama chat client, further up here, you can see that this implements an iChat client. So this is an interface that you have to implement for your client to be compatible with all the Microsoft Extensions library functionality. So this just has a few methods on it, such as get response from the AI, get streaming response, and get service. So if we implement this interface, we can start to onboard new AI platforms, which is really interesting. And so for AWS Bedrock, I created this AWS Bedrock client. And if we go into this, you can see that this implements the iChat client interface from the Microsoft Extensions AI library. Now it's also passing in an Amazon Bedrock runtime and the model ID. And it uses this combination of things to essentially create an AWS version of the Microsoft Extensions chat client. So down here, we can see where we're starting to implement those interfaces. The only method that this app uses is get response async. So we basically just use the AWS Bedrock client to make a request to the AI, and the code before and after it is just kind of converting Microsoft Extensions chat messages into Bedrock extensions so they can be sent. And then the Bedrock responses get converted back into Microsoft Extensions chat messages. So the middle of this is really the heart of it, where we use the Bedrock client to send a request to the AI right here. And then before and after it is just some of that type conversion and making the data work in a way that's compatible with iChat client and the Microsoft Extensions libraries. So essentially, we turn AWS into a compatible client with the way our app is architected. But the long story short here is that you can add additional AI platform support to this app by simply implementing an iChat client interface like we've done here. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about, and this is the part I'm probably most excited about, are the changes to the DbChatPro GitHub project itself. So right now this is marked as private, but I'll make that public before I publish this video. So we now have this repo that's just called DbChatPro. And if you remember from previous versions of this video, every time a new video came out, there was a new GitHub repo. And that's because each one was a near rewrite of the app. This has really evolved quite a ways. And the previous code bases didn't really have that much in common. But as we've reached version 4 and 5, that code base has really stabilized. And so going forward, I don't expect massive architectural changes. The app is pretty stable in its current state. And so I want to start moving to a more iterative approach to releases. So to start with, I've now added a full README. And this is still a work in progress, but it's certainly better than what was there before. So this will tell you everything you need to know to get started with the app. So feel free to leave feedback on this or let me know if there's something else you'd like to see in here. Again, this doesn't necessarily go through how to set up all the different AI services out on those respective platforms or anything, but it does show you how to actually get the app running, assuming you have some combination of technologies you want to work with. So that should give you everything you need to get started with the app. Now, I'm also planning a separate video to kind of kickstart the beginning of this whole playlist. Right now, there's 5 videos in the playlist. But I'm working on creating sort of an intro video that essentially walks through this README and shows you how to get this app set up in detail, how all of its features work, and just kind of guide you through this whole setup process. So hopefully that'll help you in addition to this README. So look for that video soon. I'm excited about that one as well. I think it'll really round out the playlist for kind of a complete experience. Now, one important thing I should mention here is that if we go up to our tags, you can see there's actually now a tag for each release. So we have 1.0 through 5.0, or over here we can see there's 5 releases. So what I did was actually went back and added release notes for each version. So it'll say what was added, and this lines up with the other videos in the playlist. However, each of those previous versions still lives in its own repo. So I originally considered sort of backporting the code where for each version I would copy in the state of that version and kind of build out the history here. But that created all kinds of issues. And I'd really like to leave those repos out there for their corresponding videos so I can still patch them or provide updates as people are using them. But what I have done is if you go to version 1, for example, there's just a README in here, and this will point out to the separate repo for version 1. So if I were to open this, this is DbChatPro version 1, and you can see this is the really humble first version of this app. And so for versions 1 through 4, you're just going to get a README with a link out to that repo. And that way I can still maintain those and they still make sense for those corresponding videos. But as soon as you get to version 5, that's where the full code will start being included in this repo. And for version 6 and so on, those versions will stay in this repo, but we've tagged 5 now. So going forward, this will have proper versioned release history. But for those first 4, which are kind of wildly different from one another, for those, we're going to leave those in their original repos and just provide some contextual links back and forth there. So I'm really excited about what all this means for the project going forward. We've got a good README going here. We have a more intentional release strategy, and I think this is exciting for version 6 and 7 as we start to add even more features. So please leave a comment with what you'd like to see from those versions and what you'd like to see from this repo. I think this is going to be great. So thank you so much for watching. Please hit those subscribe and like buttons, and I'll see you next time.